guys, so today we're going to be taking notes on the respiratory system. So let's start with the anatomy of the respiratory system, so the structures. And it wouldn't hurt to pause this video and draw this in your notes. But we've got the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. So that's where air is coming in. The back of the throat, where the nasal cavity and the oral cavity kind of come together, that's called the pharynx. A little further down is the larynx. So this is where your vocal cords are. And then once we get into the windpipe, so once the area here separates into the esophagus, which goes into the stomach, and the trachea, which goes into the lungs. So we're following through the trachea. And then we branch off. These are called bronchi, or bronchus is singular. And then into the lungs, which are the main organs of the respiratory system. The diaphragm is that muscle underneath, which helps us to expand and contract the lungs. And that's a basic overview here. So now let's start with looking at each of them individually. So let's start with the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity is divided medially, so down the middle, by a septum, right? Like that middle part right there. We've got olfactory receptors, which detect smell. So these are part of the nervous system. They're also lined with a mucosa, which are cells that secrete mucus. And this helps to moisten the air when it's super dry or when it's really cold, and traps foreign particles. So things like dust, allergens, pollen, things that we don't want getting into our lungs. Those nasal hairs and the mucosa trap them. Then we move down into the pharynx. And again, the pharynx is the muscular passage from nasal cavity to larynx. And it's a passageway for both air and food here. Okay, so we haven't divided into the trachea and esophagus yet. Back here is where the esophagus is. So up here is the pharynx. So we're still in the middle. The larynx, let me move myself over here. Larynx is the voice box. So this is made of rigid cartilage that protrudes anteriorly, so in the front by the throat, right? So it's kind of this hard part that you can feel here. We have an epiglottis, which is, let me move this over. The epiglottis is the little flap of skin, or a little flap of tissue that's right here. So that separates food and air into appropriate channels. So it kind of, when you swallow food, down the back, so the back, this little pink, it's hard to see here, but the pink here, it goes to the stomach. This is the esophagus. The purplish color goes into the trachea, which goes into the lungs. So this epiglottis, this little flap of tissue here, kind of closes over the larynx so that food can go behind it and doesn't go into the lungs. When someone chokes, it's usually when someone is talking or coughing while they're swallowing, so that this epiglottis is open, letting air out at the same time as you're swallowing. So that's kind of when choking happens. The vocal cords are also in this place, so they are little flaps of tissue that vibrate with expelled air to create sound. And the opening between the vocal cords is called the glottis. So that's right here. You can also see that here. So in years where we go to pro-EMS, you guys actually do intubations. So you put tubes into the trachea of a patient who isn't breathing. And one way that you figure out where you are once you're in the throat is by locating these vocal cords. So it kind of looks like an upside down V when you're looking down the back of the throat with that tool, and you can see that you're in the right spot by finding the vocal cords. You know you're going into the lungs and not into the stomach. Next we have the trachea, or the windpipe, which connects the larynx to the bronchi. So this is that that long tube that carries air all the way down into the lungs. And you can kind of feel it in the front because it's lined with cartilage. So if you see here, the walls are reinforced with cartilage, that hard tissue that you can actually feel from the front, which protects your windpipe, right? If you got hit in the throat, it would take a really strong hit to collapse that windpipe. They're also lined with ciliated mucosa, similar to the nasal cavity, which beat continuously to expel debris away from the lungs, right? So that's why sometimes you wake up and you're like, right? You gotta get rid of that mucus that's been trapping things all night long. Okay, so if you're looking, again, I've been mentioning that there are two tubes when in the throat, right? So it's anterior to the esophagus, so in front of. So here is the trachea lined with that hard cartilage, and the esophagus is behind it, made of much softer tissue. Move myself over here so you can see. So that trachea is right here, starts where the larynx is, and goes all the way down to where it branches into two bronchi, which go into the lungs. I'm not going to show you intubations right now, but this is kind of what I was talking about before. So when someone needs to get intubated, it's essentially putting a tube. So if someone's not breathing on their own, we can put a tube into their trachea, right? We're looking for those vocal cords, like I mentioned earlier, looking for the vocal cords going through the larynx there, so we know we're in the right spot, going into the trachea and not into the stomach. Pumping air into the stomach for someone who's not breathing is not going to be a very efficient way to save their life. So then we go into the lungs. So these occupy most of the thoracic cavity. There's a little space, a notch for the heart on the left lung. Remember, we're looking at anatomical position. So this is the left, this is the right. And this is where the heart would be. You don't have to memorize the lobes. So the bronchi are right here, these large branches. So once that trachea branches off into two, we call those bronchi or bronchus, singular. The bronchi are subdivided into smaller and smaller branches, just like a tree branch. As they get smaller, they're called bronchioles. So those tiny little tree branches are bronchioles. And at the very end of the bronchioles are something called alveoli. So we'll look at those more closely in a second. And just get to the bronchioles. So again, these are really small branches of the bronchi, and each of them ends with alveoli. These are the functional units of the lungs. This is where the gas exchange is actually happening, the important stuff. All right, so here's a diagram of an alveoli here. Alveolus is singular. So this is the site of gas exchange. This is where we are taking in oxygen into the blood, getting rid of carbon dioxide. So the thin cells line the walls. They're only one cell thick, really thin. So one cell thick for the alveoli and one cell thick on the capillaries. So really teeny tiny things we're talking about here. Covered with capillaries on the external surface. So you can see here, it kind of looks like a bunch of grapes that are covered on the outside with a spider web of capillaries. That's exactly what it is. Okay, if we look closely here, so this is a zoomed in version. So this large balloon space would be the alveoli, and then these spaces in between, these are the capillary beds. Okay, and if you zoom in even more, we can see that diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and I'll explain more about those in a second. Okay, so the gas exchange, super important here, because this is the functional unit. This is the main function of the respiratory system, to get oxygen in, to get carbon dioxide out. So gases cross the cell membrane by diffusion. Remember from biology class, diffusion is what? It's the movement of molecules from high concentration to low concentration. Okay, so when we breathe in, we have a high concentration of oxygen in our lungs, in our alveoli. So oxygen diffuses from high concentration in the alveoli to low concentration in the lungs because the blood that's entering the lungs is low in oxygen. We call it deoxygenated. So this has low oxygen. So the oxygen just naturally moves from high to low concentration. It's small enough to fit right across the cell membranes of both of these cells. So it just moves right across from high to low concentration. Opposite is happening with carbon dioxide, right? The blood is carrying carbon dioxide in the blood. Carbon dioxide rich blood is entering the lungs because from the muscles and from the organs, we used oxygen and glucose to make energy, ATP. Byproduct of that is carbon dioxide. So that waste product travels through the blood to the lungs. And where there's a high concentration in the blood, low concentration in the lungs, and just like the oxygen, it diffuses from the blood to the lungs. So there's diffusion happening in both directions here. So there's another important component of the lungs that I'd like to mention. It's called surfactant. So pulmonary surfactant is a mixture of liquids and proteins that cover the entire alveolar surface of the lung. So it lines the alveoli on the inside. Let me move myself so you can see. So this reduces surface tension between the air and the mucus surface of the lungs to prevent airway collapse. And it also provides some protection against invading microorganisms. Okay, really important component. It's like that nice gooey mucus that covers the inside of our lungs. And it has those two important functions. So we have normal alveoli here, covered in surfactant. When there's not a lot of surfactant, these alveoli can actually collapse. And you can imagine if they're collapsing, they're probably not functioning very well. This is actually one thing that happens with COVID, is that it attacks the surfactant, the cells that make the surfactant. So this is kind of what's causing patients who have severe symptoms to not be able to breathe very well because their alveoli are actually collapsing due to the lack of surfactant. Fun fact. Okay, so here's just another quick little diagram of alveoli with surfactant. So there's equal surface tension. Without surfactant, there's less surface tension. So the walls of the alveoli can actually collapse inward. All right, sorry, ignore this slide. So now let's talk about functions of the respiratory system. Main function, gas exchange, right? So this is the site of gas exchange between the blood and the external environment. Passageways of the lungs also purify, warm, humidify incoming air, but that main function is gas exchange. If we can't do this, you're not going to be alive very long. Here's another really nice diagram showing a nice healthy lung here, zoomed in alveoli at the end of all of these branches, and then showing that gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood. So the respiratory system works really closely with the circulatory system, you can imagine. Okay, so let's just look super quickly at intrapulmonary pressure. So this is the pressure within the pleural cavity, so between the lung and the cavity around the lung. So normally this is slightly less than the atmospheric pressure, which is called negative pressure. When the pleural cavity is damaged and the intrapleural pressure becomes equal to or exceeds atmospheric pressure, it can cause something called a pneumothorax, which is a collapsed lung. Okay, so that's what's being shown here. So if there's a puncture here, if there's too much pressure being forced into the lungs, all those things can cause a lung to collapse. And here you can see it on an x-ray. You can see all those bronchi just collapse down to here, and all this outside is just empty space. Okay, hope this was helpful, and bring any questions to class with you next time. Bye-bye.